He said it loud enough for everyone on the battlefield to hear. The enemy Alpha had 300 wolves at his back and the arrogance of a man who had never in his life encountered a consequence that outmatched him. He looked at the Iron Spire pack's defensive line, looked at the wolves assembled to hold the ridge, and his gaze traveled the line until it stopped on the one figure that was not where figures of her rank were supposed to be. An Omega. Standing at the front. He laughed. He said it to his commanders first, and then he said it to the whole field. He said, "They sent an Omega to hold the ridge." He said, "Is this what the Iron Spire pack has left?" He said, "Go back inside and send a real Alpha before I stop finding this amusing." The Iron Spire line did not move. She did not move. She was 23 years old, and she had been classified as a low-rank Omega since her first assessment at age 12, and she had spent 11 years in the specific silence that comes from choosing every single day not to show what you are because the world you are in cannot handle what you are. Not silence from weakness. Silence as strategy. Silence as the specific patience of someone who has been waiting for the exact right moment for 11 years and has not found it yet. She found it on this ridge. What the enemy Alpha did not know, what even the Iron Spire Alpha standing 10 feet behind her did not know, was what Eira Vane had been hiding since she was 12 years old and put her hand on the assessment stone and felt what came back from it and understood with perfect clarity that showing what came back from it would be the last thing she ever did as a free wolf. She had not shown it. For 11 years she had carried it so quietly that 3 pack healers had assessed her, and all 3 had written the same word in the same field of her file. Omega. No secondary classification. No anomalous notation. No flag. Just the one word that meant the world had decided she was at the bottom of everything and could stop looking for her closer to the top. The enemy Alpha was still laughing when the ground changed. Not shaking. Not cracking. Changing, in the specific way that ground changes when something using the deep old authority of the wolf hierarchy's actual top tier presses its full weight onto the earth, and the earth responds the way it always responds to that weight. By acknowledging it. The laughter stopped. The 300 wolves at the enemy Alpha's back went still in the involuntary way, the way that has nothing to do with training or discipline and everything to do with what the wolf nature in each of them had just received from the ridge. And Eira Vane, who had been silent for 11 years and was done being silent, looked at the enemy Alpha across the battlefield and said, in the first words she had spoken in a field engagement in her entire career, "You have your answer." The story of what happened next is the story of what was always going to happen once she stopped hiding. Stay for it. Subscribe. Comment. Like. Share. Hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us what you think Eira is about to do. Share this with everyone who loves a wolf heroine who chose silence as a weapon and finally chose to put it down. Like the video. Chapter 1. The weight of what she carried. The Iron Spire pack occupied the northern ridge territories of the Ashvale Range and had done so for 4 generations under the unbroken leadership of the Vane bloodline. A lineage that had produced 5 consecutive alphas of sufficient capability and strategic intelligence that the pack had maintained its position despite being surrounded on 3 sides by larger packs with expanding ambitions. The current alpha was Eira's uncle. His name was Aldrich Vane, and he was 51 years old and had been running the Iron Spire pack for 19 years with the specific combination of genuine tactical intelligence and personal stubbornness that had kept a mid-sized pack alive through 3 territorial wars and a sustained campaign by the Greyvale pack to the east to make the Iron Spire's southern border uncomfortable enough to force a treaty revision in Greyvale's favor. He had not revised the treaty. He had also not, in 19 years of running his pack and more than 30 years of knowing his niece, looked at Eira Vane and seen what was actually there. Eira did not blame him for this. She had worked very hard to make sure he did not see it. She was standing at the eastern ridge perimeter doing the morning ward check that was her assigned duty as a low-rank pack member when she felt the approaching force through the earth. Not through scent, not through sound, not through any of the standard sensory channels that Wolf's situational awareness used. Through the ground itself, through the specific frequency of several hundred feet in combat configuration, moving across the valley approach that was 12 kilometers south of the ridge. She had been receiving information this way since she was 12. She had never told anyone. She completed the ward check, noted nothing anomalous in the ward log, and went to find her uncle. Aldrich was in the command post at the ridge's western anchor point, reviewing supply rotation reports with his head beta, a battle-experienced wolf named Torin who had been in the role for 8 years and who was one of 3 people in the Iron Spire pack who had standing permission to disagree with the Alpha in a formal session. Eira stood at the command post entrance and waited. This was itself a statement about how the pack understood her. She waited because arriving at a command post was not something a low-rank Omega did by right. She waited because the 11 years of silence she had built included the social architecture of someone who never demanded space and always let space be offered. Torin saw her first. He said, "Eira." Aldrich looked up. She said, "I need to report a formation approach on the Southern Valley Road. Approximately 280 to 300 wolves in combat configuration. Travel pace suggests arrival at the ridge in 4 to 5 hours." Both men looked at her. Torin said, "You felt that from the eastern perimeter." She said, "Yes." He said, "That is 12 kilometers." She said, "Yes." He did not ask her how. He had worked alongside Eira Vane for 8 years and had developed the specific pragmatic acceptance of someone who had stopped trying to categorize her and simply used the information she provided because it was always accurate. Aldrich moved to the tactical map immediately. He said, "Gray Vale." She said, "The formation density is not standard Gray Vale configuration. The approach route is from the south-southeast, which is not a direction Gray Vale uses, because it requires them to cross neutral territory. This is either Harrowfall or a coalition force." Aldrich studied the map. He said, "If it is Harrowfall acting without the coalition treaty, they have broken the Northern Accord. That gives us grounds we have not had before." He said, "If it is a coalition force, we are looking at a coordinated push to take the ridge while the seasonal weather makes reinforcement from our eastern allies difficult." Eira said, "The timing of the approach relative to the weather window is not coincidental." Torin said, "She is right. Someone planned this around the pass closure schedule." Aldrich began issuing deployment orders. He did not include Eira in the deployment orders. She was a low-rank Omega. Her contribution to the pack's defensive operations was the information she provided and the ward maintenance she performed and the dozen other support functions that low-rank wolves performed without being placed in the line. She accepted her assignment to the secondary supply coordination post and went to it. She accepted it because she was not ready yet. She had been making this calculation for 11 years, the calculation of when the right moment was, and the calculation had always returned the same answer. Not yet. Not because the capability was insufficient. Because the cost of revealing it was permanent and irreversible, and she had not yet identified a situation where the permanence and irreversibility were worth the specific thing the moment would cost her. She went to the supply coordination post, and she did her assigned work, and she felt the approaching force through the ground getting closer across the 4 hours the approach took. She felt the composition of it change twice. The first change was the arrival of a second smaller formation from the east, moving to merge with the main force at the valley floor. Someone had staged the eastern component to arrive simultaneously, approaching from the direction of Greyvale territory and completing the encirclement of the ridge's 2 most vulnerable approach vectors. The second change was the quality of the formation's command signal. She felt it the way you feel a signal from something that operates on a frequency above the standard command range. And the signal was coming from one wolf in the combined force whose presence in the ground frequency was considerably stronger than the standard alpha signal. She stood at the supply post and held still and assessed what she was feeling with the specific careful attention of someone who had been assessing things through the ground frequency for 11 years and had developed a very precise vocabulary for what different signals meant. What she was feeling from the approaching force's commander was not the standard alpha signal. It was close to what she felt from herself when she let the full extent of her own nature surface, which she did only in private and only in the forest outside the pack territory where no one could observe it. Close to, but not the same. Because the signal she received from the approaching commander was below hers in the hierarchy that the ground frequency communicated. And the hierarchy the ground frequency communicated was the oldest and most accurate classification system in wolf history, the one that predated every pack governance structure and every assessment stone and every ranking ceremony. She went back to the command post. She said, "The Force Commander is not a standard alpha. The classification is above standard alpha in the old hierarchy." Aldrich looked at her. He said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means the tactical situation is more complicated than the formation numbers suggest, and you should know that before the engagement begins." She said, "It also means I need to be at the front line." The command post went quiet in the specific way of a room where something has just been said that does not fit the established understanding of the situation. Torin looked at her. Aldrich said, "Eira." She said, "I know what I am asking. I am asking it because the tactical situation requires it, and because I have been waiting for the situation that required it for 11 years, and this is that situation. You do not have anyone else on this ridge whose classification matches what is coming down that valley road." Aldrich said, "You are classified as Omega." She said, "I know what my file says. I also know what I am." She met his eyes. She said, "Put me at the front of the line. When the engagement begins, you will understand why." The silence held for a long moment. Then Torin said, quietly to Aldrich, "She has never been wrong about anything she has told us. Not once in 8 years." Aldrich looked at his niece with the expression of a man who has been knowing someone for 30 years and is understanding in this moment that he has not known them at all. He said, "Front of the line." She said, "Yes." He said, "And if I am about to watch my niece get killed in the first exchange?" She said, "You are not." She said it with a specific quality of absolute certainty, not confidence, not bravado, but the settled factual tone of someone who knows the ground beneath their feet completely and is describing what is on it. He put her at the front of the line. She stood there for 2 hours while the formation assembled on the valley floor below the ridge. She stood there when the enemy Alpha rode to the front of his force and looked up at the Iron Spire defensive line, and his gaze found her. She stood there when he laughed. She stood there while he said what he said. And then she let the ground feel what she was. Just a fraction of it. Just enough. The silence that followed was the silence of 300 wolves whose wolf nature had just received information that their training and their commanders and their institutional framework had not prepared them for. Eira looked at the enemy Alpha across the valley. She said, "You have your answer." And the battle for the Iron Spire Ridge began. Chapter 2. The ground that knew her name. The engagement did not go the way either side had planned it. Enemy forces had planned a coordinated press up the ridge face using the combined formation's numerical advantage and the elevated classification of their commander to break the Iron Spire defensive line within the first 30 minutes. The plan was sound. It had been built on an accurate assessment of the Iron Spire pack's defensive capabilities and an accurate read of the weather window and an accurate calculation of what the ridge's strategic value was worth in the broader territorial conflict. The plan had one inaccuracy. It had not accounted for what was standing at the front of the Iron Spire line. Eira held the center. She had not shifted yet. She was standing in human form at the front of the Iron Spire defensive line, and the ground was doing what it did when she let her full nature surface, organizing itself around her in the specific way of terrain that has received the signal of its highest tier occupant and is responding accordingly. The enemy advance formation hit the lower ridge slope and stopped. Not because of the Iron Spire wolves above them. Not because of the ward lines or the defensive positioning or any of the tactical factors that Torin had arranged with considerable skill. The advance formation stopped because every wolf in it hit the ground frequency signal that Eira was broadcasting at the lower ridge slope's elevation, and their wolf nature executed the involuntary assessment response. The assessment response said, "Recategorize. The thing at the top of this ridge is not in the category you were briefed on." 7 wolves in the advance formation went immediately to their knees. Not submission. The specific involuntary position of wolves whose classification hierarchy instinct has been activated by a signal that is above their operational framework. The enemy alpha saw it from the valley floor. He stopped laughing. He drove the advanced formation forward manually, overriding the instinctive response with his own alpha command signal. He was strong enough to do it. The formation moved up the ridge again. Eira waited until they reached the second slope tier. Then she shifted. What the Ironspire wolves behind her experienced was not what they had expected from someone whose file said low-rank Omega. What the enemy advanced formation experienced was considerably more significant. The shift was not the standard transformation from human to wolf. It was the expression of 11 years of managed suppression releasing in a single breath, the full weight of what she had been carrying becoming the full weight of what she was, and the ground registered every gram of it. She was the color of old winter sky before a storm, a deep blue-gray that in certain light carried silver like lightning held in the coat, and she was large in the way that altered the geometry of the ridge. Not large the way a big wolf was large. Large the way certainty is large, in a way that made every other measure of size on the field suddenly feel like a different category of measurement entirely. Her eyes were pale silver with a ring of deep blue at the outer iris. The advanced formation broke. Not retreated. Broke, which is a different thing. Retreating is tactical. Breaking is what happens when the wolf nature of a trained combat force receives a signal so far above its operational ceiling that its training simply ceases to function as the organizing principle of its behavior. The enemy alpha charged. She had felt him coming for 3 minutes before he moved. The ground frequency gave her the specific quality of a wolf preparing to engage, the pre-charged tension that moved through the soil from a commander gathering his full alpha authority into a single directed act. He was not a small thing. His wolf was the deep gray-black of storm cloud at full pressure, and his size was the size of an alpha who had been at the top of his classification for his entire adult life, and had spent that adult life developing what he carried with the specific intensity of someone who had always believed he was the most powerful wolf in any room he walked into. He had, until this morning, been correct about that. He charged the ridge with the full force of everything he was. What happened next was witnessed by every wolf on both sides of the engagement and was described afterward in 47 separate accounts that the Ironspire Pack's record keeper spent a month collecting because no single account captured it completely. She did not meet his charge with force. She did not move at all. She stood at the ridge front and she pressed her full nature into the ground and the ground rose to meet him. Not literally. The ground did not move in the visible dramatic way of a landslide or a seismic event. What happened was the specific effect of the highest-tier wolf authority in the old hierarchy making direct contact with the ground of a territory and the territory responding as it was organized by the old law to respond, as an extension of its sovereign's will. The enemy alpha hit the territory force 3 meters from her. It was like hitting a wall that had the properties of a wall but was made of something that could not be damaged because it was not physical. He went sideways. Not knocked sideways. Redirected, in the specific way of a force encountering something categorically beyond its operational parameters. He shifted back to human form. He was on one knee on the ridge slope. He was looking at her. His expression was doing something she had not expected. It was not fury. It was not the expression of a commander whose tactical plan had failed. It was something she had very little experience with being on the receiving end of. The specific expression of someone who has just encountered a thing they did not believe existed and is in the process of understanding that their entire framework for the world needs rebuilding. He said, from one knee on the ridge slope, with his 300 wolves standing still on the valley floor below, "What are you?" Eira shifted back. She stood at the front of the Ironspire line in her formal tactical clothing, and she looked down at the commander of the force that had come to take the ridge, and she said, "The thing you sent 300 wolves to fight before you understood what you were fighting." She said, "Call them back." He looked at her for a long moment. His name was Calder Reth and he was 34 years old, and he had been the alpha of the Harrowfall Pack for 6 years, and he had never in those 6 years, or in the 12 years before them that he had spent developing himself toward that role encountered anything That made him go to one knee on someone else's ground before the engagement was concluded. He called his force back. The valley floor cleared. Aldrich appeared at Eira's shoulder. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Eira." She said, "I know." He said, "What you just did." She said, "I know." He said, "The file says." She said, "I know what the file says. The file is wrong. It has been wrong for 11 years, and I made it wrong deliberately, and I will explain everything. I owe you an explanation for when the tactical situation is resolved." She looked at the valley floor where the Harrowfall pack force was reassembling into a stationary formation. She said, "The commander did not withdraw. He called his force back, but he is still on the field, and he is not moving toward the retreat route. He wants to talk." Aldrich said, "You want to talk to him?" She said, "I want to understand why a pack of Harrowfall's strategic position would risk the Northern Accord violation that this engagement represents. The tactical calculation does not add up for Harrowfall acting alone. Someone sent them." Aldrich said, "And if this is a trap?" She said, "He went to one knee on our ridge. That is not trap behavior. That is the behavior of someone who encountered something that genuinely reorganized their understanding and is now trying to recalibrate." She said, "I am going down to the valley floor." Aldrich said, "Alone?" She said, "With you and Torin. And the line holds the ridge." She walked down the ridge slope toward the man who had mocked her an hour ago. She walked with the specific quality of someone who had spent 11 years moving through the world quietly and was now simply walking toward what needed to be addressed. The ground was warm under her feet. It always was. That was the thing she had never been able to explain to anyone. The ground was warm because it knew her. And she had never, in 11 years, let anyone else know that. Chapter 3. What he had been sent to find. Calder Reth was still on one knee when she reached him. Not because he was injured. Not because the territory force had damaged him physically. He was on one knee because he had not yet processed the complete implications of standing back up in the presence of what he had just experienced, and Calder Reth was not the kind of man who moved before he had processed the complete implications of something. He was a methodical man. He had built everything he was through a specific combination of raw capability and the methodical application of that capability, and the method required understanding before action. He stood when she was 10 feet from him. He stood to his full height, which was considerable, and he looked at her with those storm cloud eyes that she had felt through the ground frequency for 4 hours before she ever saw them. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You owe me a great deal more than that, but the apology is a reasonable starting point." He said, "I was not sent to take the ridge." Eira stopped walking. She said, "The formation approach and timing were consistent with a ridge capture operation." He said, "The formation approach and timing were consistent with a demonstration of force sufficient to compel a negotiation. Taking the ridge was the fallback if the negotiation was refused." He said, "The negotiation was always the primary objective." She said, "What negotiation?" He looked at her for a moment with those storm cloud eyes, and then he looked at Aldrich, who had come down the ridge with Torin and was standing 6 feet to Eira's left. He said, "The negotiation that the Greyvale Pack and the Mirefall Coalition have been trying to force on the Iron Spire Pack for 2 years through the escalating border pressure campaign. The treaty revisions they want would give them passage rights through the Iron Spire Ridge territory that would effectively allow them to encircle the 3 independent packs on the eastern side of the Ashbale Range." He said, "I was told the Iron Spire Pack had exhausted its defensive options and that a demonstration of superior force would produce a treaty revision agreement within 48 hours. He said, "I was told there was no wolf in the Iron Spire Pack whose classification was above Standard Alpha." He let that sit. Aldrich said, "Who told you?" Calder said, "The Greyvale Pack's Alpha and the Mirefall Coalition's Governing Council, who were themselves told this by the intelligence assessment they received from a source inside the Iron Spire Pack's administrative structure." The 3 Iron Spire wolves went still. Eira said, "An intelligence source inside Iron Spire." He said, "Yes." She said, Someone who knew the classification file said what it said and confirmed it to Greyvale and Myrefall to support their argument that Iron Spire could be compelled to negotiate. He said, yes. She said, and Harrowfall was brought in because your pack is the only pack in the Northern Territories with a commander whose classification would have been sufficient to take the ridge against standard Iron Spire defenses. He said, yes. Although not for the reasons Greyvale and Myrefall believed. She said, what do you mean? He said, my arrangement with Greyvale and Myrefall was that I would participate in the demonstration if the negotiation failed. What I did not tell them, and what I have not told anyone, is that I had a separate reason for coming north personally. He looked at her. He said, I felt you through the ground frequency 4 hours before we reached the valley floor. The field was quiet. Aldrich and Torin both looked at Eira. She said, you felt me. He said, in the old hierarchy. The ground frequency. I have been able to receive it since I was 16, and I have never told anyone for the same reason I suspect you have never told anyone. He said, I have never in 16 years of receiving the ground frequency felt another wolf in it except myself. He said, until 4 hours ago. He said, I came north because whatever was broadcasting from the Iron Spire Ridge in the ground frequency was something I needed to understand. The engagement was the only available mechanism for getting close enough to understand it. Eira looked at him for a long time. She said, you are telling me that you operate in the old hierarchy. He said, I am telling you that I've been the only thing I knew of that operated in the old hierarchy for 16 years, and that finding out I was wrong about that is significant enough that I was willing to stage a military demonstration to reach you. He said, which I am aware is not a conventional approach to making an introduction. Something moved across her face that was not quite the beginnings of a smile, but was in the same family as one. She said, no, it is not. She said, the Greyvale intelligence source inside this pack. He said, I do not have a name. I have an operational description. Someone with access to the pack's classification records and sufficient standing in the pack administration to make their intelligence assessment credible to Greyvale. She looked at Aldrich. He was looking at the ground. She had never seen her uncle look at the ground. She said, Aldrich. He looked up. His expression was the expression of a man who has understood something he did not want to understand. He said, the classification review 3 years ago. I authorized it to look for any wolves in the pack whose files might be outdated. The review was conducted by the pack's records administrator. He said, the records administrator was seconded from the Greyvale pack 6 years ago as part of a resource-sharing arrangement. He said, I did not see it. Eira said, the review was how they confirmed the classification file said what it said. He said, yes. She said, and the records administrator would have been the one to confirm the intelligence. He said, yes. She said, then we have a source to address and a coalition to dismantle and a treaty situation to resolve. She looked at Calder. She said, your arrangement with Greyvale and Myrefall. He said, was contingent on the demonstration producing a negotiation. The demonstration did not produce a negotiation. It produced this conversation. My arrangement is voided by the outcome. She said, you are willing to say that formally. He said, I am willing to say it formally, in writing, to the Interpack Treaty Council with full documentation of what Greyvale and Myrefall presented to me as justification for my participation. She said, that documentation would constitute evidence of treaty violation by Greyvale and Myrefall rather than by Harrowfall. He said, yes. She said, which would reverse the diplomatic position entirely. He said, yes. She said, why? He said, because what Greyvale and Myrefall described to me was not an Iron Spire pack that had exhausted its defensive options. It was a deliberate misrepresentation of the actual situation designed to use Harrowfall as an instrument of aggression against a pack that had done nothing to justify it. I do not participate in that kind of arrangement knowingly. I was not participating in it knowingly. I am not going to continue now that I know. He said. And, because the wolf standing in front of me right now is not the wolf the intelligence assessment described, and the gap between those two things is information that the Treaty Council needs to have. Eira held his gaze for a moment. She said, "Come up to the command post. All of this needs to be in writing before the day ends." She turned and walked back up the ridge. He fell into step beside her. The ground was warm under both of them. She noticed that. She filed it with the care she gave to things that were significant and not yet fully understood. This story is far from finished. Stay with it. Subscribe right now. Leave a comment and tell us what you think of Eira. Has a werewolf heroine ever hit you like this before? Share this story with every person who deserves a wolf who does not wait for permission to be what she is. Like the video. Comment your most powerful moment from this chapters. Share it everywhere. Every subscribe, every like, every share, every comment keeps this story alive. Subscribe, like, comment, and share. Chapter 4. The Fight They Could Not Avoid. The Greyvale Pack's response to Calder's formal withdrawal from the coalition arrangement arrived on the 5th day in the form of a second force. Not the negotiated demonstration force that Harrowfall had brought. This was a Greyvale force, purely, with the specific composition of a pack that had decided the diplomatic route was exhausted and the direct route was the only remaining option. 460 wolves. Eira felt them at dawn on the 5th day, still 2 hours from the valley floor, and she had the ridge line fully repositioned before Torin had finished his morning command briefing. She had been awake since before dawn. For 5 days, because the 5 days since the Harrowfall engagement had been the 5 most operationally dense days of her adult life, and she had been using every hour of them with the specific efficiency of someone who understood that the window between the first engagement and the second one was not a rest period, but a preparation period. In those 5 days, she had done the following. She had provided formal written testimony to Torin and 2 Pack Council members documenting the full extent of her capability classification and the 11 years of deliberate suppression of it, including the specific reasons for the suppression and the specific circumstances of her initial assessment at age 12 that had made the suppression necessary. The testimony was witnessed and sealed and entered into the formal Pack record. She had worked with Calder, who had stayed at the Ironspire command post with a reduced company of 12 of his senior wolves, to document the Greyvale and Mirefall misrepresentation to the Interpack Treaty Council in full detail. That documentation had been dispatched through the Treaty Council's emergency courier system on day 2. She had identified the Greyvale Records Administrator. The administrator's name was Fenwick. He had been embedded in the Ironspire administrative structure for 6 years and had, over those 6 years, conducted himself with sufficient professional competence that nobody had looked closely at the pattern of what information he accessed and when. Eira had looked closely. She had looked closely because she had always looked closely at things that she could not verify through the ground frequency and that required the kind of attention to human behavioral pattern that 11 years of being underestimated had given her in abundance. She had given Aldrich the documentation on day 3. Fenwick had been in Pack custody since day 3 evening. She had also had 5 days of conversations with Calder Reth that had begun as tactical and intelligence coordination and had become, across the hours of those 5 days, something that was still tactical and intelligence in its content, but was not only that in its quality. He was not what she had expected. She had expected a commander whose confidence in his capability was the confidence of someone who had not yet encountered a limit to it and would not handle limits well when he found them. That was the profile of the voice she had heard mocking her from the valley floor. What she found across 5 days of close operational work was someone whose confidence was the confidence of someone who had encountered limits and had built from them rather than around them. The mockery from the valley floor had been a tactical read of the situation, as he had understood it at the time. When the situation changed, his response had not been ego defense. It had been immediate recalibration. She respected recalibration. She had been recalibrating continuously for 11 years. He asked her on the 4th evening what it had been like to carry what she carried for that long. She told him the truth. She said it had been lonely in the specific way that secrets are lonely, not because she was without connection, but because the connection she had was always partial, always missing the component that could not be shared. And the missing component was the most fundamental one. He was quiet for a moment. He said, 16 years. She said, yes. He said, I stopped expecting to find another wolf in the old hierarchy frequency approximately 12 years ago. I filed it in the category of things that were simply part of my specific situation and did not require resolution. She said, and now? He said, and now I am revising that filing. She held that. She held it with the care she gave to things that were significant. On the 5th morning, she stood at the ridge front in the dawn and felt 460 Greyvale wolves 2 hours out and made her final preparations. Calder came to stand beside her. He said, I want to fight on the line. She said, your pack is not a party to this engagement. He said, I am. She said, the Treaty Council has not yet ruled on the documentation. Until they rule, you are technically still in a coalition arrangement with Greyvale. He said, the coalition arrangement was contingent on conditions that were not met. I filed the withdrawal on day 2. I am not in the arrangement. She said, Aldrich. Aldrich, standing 10 feet behind them at the command post entrance, said, he holds the eastern anchor. We are short there. Calder looked at her. She said, eastern anchor. He took the eastern anchor position. What followed across the next 3 hours was the most significant military engagement the Iron Spire Ridge had seen in 40 years, and it was significant not because of the scale, though the scale was considerable, but because of what happened at its center. The Greyvale Alpha was a wolf named Vexer, 52 years old, who had been running the Greyvale pack for 20 years with the specific combination of genuine strategic intelligence and the specific kind of ruthlessness that comes from believing that what is good for your pack is sufficient justification for whatever you do to get it. He was not a simple villain. He was a man who had rationalized everything he had done for 20 years as pack leadership and had lost the ability to distinguish between the rationalization and the reality. He came up the ridge personally with the second wave of his force. He knew what he was going to find at the front of the Iron Spire line. His intelligence had failed on the classification question, but 5 days had given him enough information from scattered accounts of the first engagement to update his operational picture. He had updated it. He had planned his approach to the ridge accordingly. He had brought 460 wolves because 460 was what his analysis suggested was necessary to overcome what he now understood to be at the front of that line. His analysis was not entirely wrong. 460 wolves pushing up a defended ridge would have posed a genuine challenge even for what Eira was, because the challenge in that scenario was not capability but time. Enough wolves in enough coordinated motion could achieve by sheer mass of effort what they could not achieve individually. What his analysis had not accounted for was the eastern anchor. Calder held the eastern anchor with 12 Harrowfall wolves and himself, and what he brought to the eastern anchor was his own old hierarchy classification operating in support of the ridge's primary sovereign, which in the combined ground frequency produced an effect that neither of them had been able to predict from theory because neither of them had ever operated in proximity to another old hierarchy wolf before. The combined frequency was not additive. It was multiplicative. The eastern flank of the Greyvale advance hit the combined frequency at the anchor point and went flat. Not the rolling wave of involuntary response that standard wolves showed in proximity to a single old hierarchy wolf. The complete and immediate cessation of forward motion, as if every wolf in that flank had walked into a wall made of something their wolf nature absolutely refused to go through. The Greyvale Alpha saw his eastern flank collapse. He drove the center harder. Eira was at the center. What happened at the center of the Iron Spire Ridge in the afternoon of the 5th day was the full expression of what the old hierarchy was and what it was for. Not personal combat. Not a single wolf defeating another single wolf. The expression of territory authority at full depth, the sovereign of a territory making absolute the proposition that this ground was held and nothing that moved against the sovereign's will was going to move through it. The center of the Greyvale advance hit the full expression and broke. Completely. Not the tactical break of a force that has encountered resistance and is recalculating. The complete dissolution of a coordinated military force into individual wolves who had lost access to the collective decision-making framework that made a formation rather than a collection of individuals. Individual wolves do not take defended ridges. Vexor was at the front of the center wave when it broke. He was a large and capable alpha, and he was not broken the way his formation was broken. But he was alone, surrounded by wolves who were no longer receiving his command signal as the organizing principle of their behavior, and the thing at the top of the ridge was looking at him with pale silver eyes ringed in deep blue. He had been a pack leader for 20 years. He knew what this was. He shifted back. He looked at her from the slope. He said, "This is not over." She said, "It is over for today. What comes after today will be addressed through the Treaty Council process that Harrowfall initiated." She said, "You should know that the Myrefall Coalition received the same documentation Harrowfall submitted, and that the Treaty Council's emergency session was scheduled for 6 days from now." She said, "You should go home and prepare your formal response." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Who are you?" She said, "Eira Vane. Ironspire Pack. Front of the line." He turned and walked back down the ridge. His force followed. The ridge was quiet. Calder came from the eastern anchor across the ridge top to where she was standing. He said, "The combined frequency." She said, "Yes." He said, "I did not know that was possible." She said, "Neither did I." He said, "Eira." She looked at him. He said, "When this is over." She said, "When this is over, we will have time to understand what that was." He said, "Yes." He said, "I am looking forward to it." The afternoon light was long across the ridge, and the Ironspire territory was warm under both of them, and the ground frequency was steady and calm in the way of a territory that has been tested and has held. Chapter 5. What silence had been building. The Interpact Treaty Council convened its emergency session on the 6th day in the neutral territory of the Silverstone Meeting Ground, the formal diplomatic venue that the Northern Pacts had been using for treaty proceedings for 140 years. Eira attended as the Ironspire Pact's primary representative. This was not a standard arrangement. The primary representative of a pack in treaty proceedings was typically the Alpha, or the Alpha's designated senior beta. Eira was neither. What she was, as of the formal testimony that had been entered into the pack record on day 1, was the Ironspire Pack's highest classified wolf, and the wolf whose specific capability was central to the treaty violation evidence. Aldrich had made the designation after a conversation that had lasted 2 hours and had covered, among other things, 30 years of knowing his niece and 11 years of not knowing her, and the specific weight of both of those things and what he intended to do about them going forward. She had told him he had nothing to apologize for. He had said, "I am going to apologize anyway." She had said, "I know. Go ahead." He had. The Treaty Council session was attended by representatives from 7 packs, including Greyvale and Myrefall, whose representatives arrived with the specific body language of people who had been briefed on what the documentation said and had spent 5 days constructing a response to it. Calder Reth attended as Harrowfall's representative. He sat across the formal council table from Eira, and they did not look at each other in the way of 2 people who have been in each other's operational space for 5 days and have arrived at a mutual understanding that the formal setting is not the right venue for what is between them and are managing that with professional precision. Eira presented the documentation. Not the way that diplomats presented documentation, with the framing language and the strategic positioning and the careful management of emphasis that formal treaty proceedings typically involved. She presented it the way she did everything, with direct, complete accuracy and no performance attached to it. The intelligence source. The Records Administrator Fenwick, his 6 years in the Ironspire administrative structure, the specific access events that documented what information had been passed to Greyvale and when. The misrepresentation to Harrowfall of the Ironspire Pack's defensive capabilities, and the deliberate concealment of the classification information that would have materially affected Harrowfall's decision to participate. The coordinated nature of the border pressure campaign over 2 years. All of it. She also presented her own formal classification documentation. The Treaty Council had never in its 140-year history received a formal classification submission in the old hierarchy taxonomy. The old hierarchy taxonomy predated the current assessment system by 400 years and was considered by the majority of Treaty Council members to be a historical artifact with no practical governance application. After 40 minutes of reviewing the documentation, including the assessment stone record from age 12 that the Ironspire Pack's archives had retained and that showed exactly what had registered that day and what Eira had done with the registration, the Treaty Council's senior member asked her to step outside for 10 minutes while the council deliberated. She stepped outside. Calder was in the corridor. He said, "You did not tell them everything." She said, "I told them everything relevant to the treaty violation." He said, "You did not tell them about the combined frequency." She said, "The combined frequency is not documented in any treaty framework. It does not have a governance application in the current structure. It is also something I do not fully understand yet, and I am not presenting something I do not fully understand in a formal treaty proceeding." He said, "We should understand it." She said, "We should." He said, "Together." She looked at him. She said, "Calder." He said, "I have been in the old hierarchy for 16 years without another wolf to think about it with. I am not going back to that." She said, "That is not entirely a diplomatic statement." He said, "No, it is not. I am making it in this corridor rather than in the treaty session because I understand the difference between diplomatic context and this context is not diplomatic." She said, "You are the alpha of a pack that is currently in a complicated treaty situation with both Greyvale and Mirefall." He said, "Yes. Which is a situation I am going to spend the next several months resolving through the Treaty Council process. It does not preclude other things." She said, "You came north with 300 wolves to compel a negotiation." He said, "I know. I owe you more than the apology I already offered." She said, "I noticed that you said you owed more, and then described it as the apology you already offered." He said, "It was not a precise statement." She said, "You tend to be very precise." He said, "I am being precise about the fact that what I owe is more than an apology, and I am not currently able to define the full scope of what it is, which means stating it precisely would require a conversation that this corridor is not the right setting for." She held that. She said, "You are right that we should understand what happened on the Eastern Anchor." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have never had another wolf in the old hierarchy frequency to think about it with either." She said, "It is an adjustment." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need to go back in when they call me." He said, "I know." She said, "The conversation this corridor is not the right setting for." He said, "Yes." She said, "Find me after the session." He said he would. The council called her back in 7 minutes later. The Treaty Council's ruling on the Greyvale and Mirefall violation was formal and comprehensive and produced the specific set of treaty revisions that Greyvale had been attempting to force on the Ironspire Pack for 2 years, in reverse. The passage rights that Greyvale had wanted through Ironspire territory were formally denied. The intelligence operation that had been run through the Embedded Records Administrator was classified as a treaty breach carrying formal censure and reparation requirements. Mirefall received a lesser finding because their involvement had been less direct, but their participation in the Coordinated Border Pressure Campaign produced a formal notation in the treaty record that would complicate their political position in the Northern Territories for years. Harrowfall was cleared of treaty violation on the grounds of documented misrepresentation by the parties who had solicited their participation. Calder Reth stood in the council chamber and received the Harrowfall clearance with the specific quality of someone who was present for the formal outcome and was thinking about something else. She noticed. After the session, she found him at the Silverstone Meeting Grounds Eastern Courtyard, the open space that the formal venue used as a between-session gathering area and that was currently occupied by representatives from 6 packs, all doing the work of processing the implications of what the session had produced. She stood beside him, and they both looked at the courtyard, and she said, "You are thinking about the combined frequency." He said, "I am thinking about several things. The combined frequency is one of them." She said, "And the others?" He said, "The others are things I am going to say to you when we are not in a courtyard full of pack representatives." She said, You are very strategic about setting, he said. 11 years in the old hierarchy without anyone to share it with produces a very precise sense of when a setting is right for something and when it is not. She said, 16 years. He said, yes. I concede the 16 years. She said, my uncle has extended a formal guest invitation to the Harrowfall delegation for the return journey. The Ironspire territory is 3 days from here. He said, I accepted the invitation yesterday. She said, before the session outcome. He said, yes. She said, that is either very confident or very presumptuous. He said, I prefer strategic. She looked at him. She said, the first time I heard you speak you were telling a battlefield to send a real alpha. He said, I know. She said, you found one. He said, I did. He said, I found something considerably more significant than that, actually, but the Treaty Council session is not the venue for the full description. She said, no, it is not. They stood in the courtyard, and the Northern Territory light was long and clear across the Silverstone meeting ground, and the ground frequency was present between them with the warm, certain quality of a thing that has been building toward an expression for 11 years, and 16 years respectively, and has finally found the conditions it requires. Aldrich appeared at the courtyard entrance. He looked at Eira and Calder standing side by side. He looked at the expression on his niece's face, the specific expression she wore when she was feeling something that she had decided not to manage for once. He walked over. He said to Calder, you are riding with us back to Ironspire. Calder said, yes. Aldrich said to Eira, I want to talk to you before we leave. About the formal classification documentation and what the pack is going to do about the 11 years that were incorrectly recorded. She said, I know. I want to talk to you too. He said, you are not still angry with me. She said, I was never angry with you. You did not know. I made sure you did not know. He said, you should have been able to tell me. She said, I am telling you now. He looked at her. He said, you have been at the front of the line for 11 years. You just did not tell anyone which line you were at. She said, yes. He said, we are going to fix the classification record. She said, yes. He said, and whatever else needs fixing. She said, yes. On the return journey to Ironspire, she and Calder rode at the back of the company where the conversation could happen at the pace it needed to happen. They talked about the ground frequency for the first 12 kilometers. About what it was and how it worked and how each of them had developed their understanding of it across 11 and 16 years of working with it alone. They talked about the combined frequency for the next 8. About what it had felt like from the inside and what the theoretical framework the old texts provided suggested about why two wolves in the old hierarchy operating in proximity on shared ground produced a multiplicative effect rather than an additive one. At some point the conversation changed in quality without either of them deciding to change it, the way conversations change when they have covered the professional and the technical and arrived at the layer underneath that was always going to be there. She did not manage it. She had been managing things for 11 years. She was done managing. The Ironspire Ridge was warm when they arrived. It was always warm. But it was warmer now in the specific way of territory that has been holding its sovereign signal for 23 years in one frequency and has just received a second frequency to hold alongside it. The ground knew. The ground had always known. It had simply been waiting for her to stop being silent about it. That is the story of Eira Vane, the Omega who was mocked on a battlefield and answered with the power of the oldest hierarchy in wolf history, who spent 11 years choosing silence as a weapon and chose the right moment to put it down, who held a ridge, dismantled a coalition, found the only other wolf in the world who understood what she was, and built something from all of it that nobody who called her a low-rank Omega could have predicted. If this story moved you, then do these 4 things right now. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Leave a comment and tell us your most powerful moment. Was it the ridge, the valley floor, the eastern anchor, or the courtyard? Share this story with everyone who deserves a wolf heroine who was never weak and never needed to perform strength. Like the video so more people find Eira. Subscribe, like, comment, and share.